Hey, this is Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop, and today I've got something super cool for you. You're going to be hearing from a guy named Alan Silverman, an incredible mastering engineer. He's been at this a long time, and he's talking all about the future of mastering and loudness and limiting in this age of streaming. The rules have completely changed since services like YouTube and Spotify and so many others do automatic volume normalization from track to track. And that means big changes for the way that we want to think about how loud is loud enough, how much limiting we should apply or shouldn't apply to our masters. And Alan talks about this in such incredible detail and just offers some tremendous expertise. It was one of my favorite moments from MixCon 2019, and I know it was one of the favorite presentations of so many of our audience members too. It was part of a panel with 3 panelists on there, but Alan got such great feedback in his presentation. I just wanted to cut this out, have it stand on its own. It's all about mastering in the 21st century, loudness in the 21st century, how mastering and loudness and getting your record loud enough and how much limiting to use, how all that is changing with streaming services. That is coming up right now. If you want to go even deeper on mastering, I'll also at the end of this video give you a link to where you can check out a free Mastering 101 workshop where you can go a little deeper into the hows and whys of mastering. But whoever you are, whether you're a musician or a recording engineer or a mastering engineer or a mixing engineer, this is a presentation I don't think you're going to want to miss, coming up right now with Alan Silverman. Mr. Alan Silverman, if we can welcome Alan up back to the stage. We'd love to get Alan up here. Alan has got a slightly more, instead of this being a little more interview focused, I talked to Alan beforehand and he said, I really need to play these people some audio clips. And for those of you who are watching the video version or here in person, you can see some slides as well. And he's going to be talking to us about loudness. So I just want to set this up by saying loudness and the loudness wars are a place where audio and music production are changing and changing dramatically. When the CD changer was a big thing, it was, hey man, we have to make sure our CD is louder than the next CD. And a whole entire skill set of smashing things, making them as loud as possible, just so they could get louder than other things, ended up coloring the sound, right? And the sounds that people got from loudness ended up being part of the aesthetic of certain genres. And if things weren't smashed with limiters or compressed heavily, it kind of sounded wrong. And then there were other genres that didn't respond well to this kind of loudness. But a big, big change that's been happening is how many of you guys have a CD with a CD changer right now by show of hands? 0 hands went up, right? So where are you listening? A lot of people now are listening on Spotify, on YouTube, on Pandora. And what do these services have in common? They automatically normalize volume. And they do it in a very simple and ingenious way. I think this is the best possible of all bad ways. They take the loudest stuff and turn it down. So what does that mean for us going forward when we're going into a new audio environment where most people are going to have tracks normalized for them? Is that going to change the way records sound? Is that going to change how we approach getting loudness? If you really smash your stuff and then expect it to be super loud and hear it on Spotify, it might get turned down and that's not louder than everything else. And then were the things you were doing to get loudness good for the tone? I don't know. That's an aesthetic question. But I think Alan can give us some great guidance on navigating loudness in general and how things are changing. So, Alan, please take it away.
Thank you, Justin. So Justin laid out the problem, which is how do we get our records to play loud? And how is that different today than it was last year or 10 years ago? Now, I love to cue up a great record and play it loud. Anyone feel the same way here? Anyone out there? Come on, of course you do. That's why we get into this crazy business in the first place, the art form of making records. We want to feel and hear all the details, feel the beat. We want to be carried away by that soaring lead vocal. So loudness has always been a source of great pleasure in music, and let's face it, louder is better. That's how the human ear works, and that is not going to change. So loudness has always been a driving goal in record making, and we want our work to jump out of the speakers. But what does that mean in practical terms? Well, loudness seems like a simple concept, just turn it up to 11, we're done, right? But as mixers, you know that it's a lot more complicated than that. Give you an example of how loudness has always driven this business. You probably all have heard of Bob Ludwig, the famous, awesome mastering engineer. So he was on a studio staff in the 1960s and cutting records, and he found out that Neumann made a new lathe that could cut a record 6 dB hotter than any other. He went to his boss and said, hey, Art, we got to get this new lathe. Art said, how much is it? Bob said, like $100,000. Art said, forget it. Bob got some investors, set up a room, bought the lathe, was cutting records 6 dB hotter than anyone in New York. Within a month, all of the business was going to Bob, all of it. And that's how his mastering business got started. So we want our records to play loud and proud on whatever medium we're working with. And as Justin pointed out, as technology changes, techniques change. And in fact, the change today is absolutely huge. The way audio is treated today is radically different from the way it has ever been treated in the past in terms of broadcast, records, media. It's a completely Alice in Wonderland world that's turned around on its head. And it's really important as producers and mixers to really understand that. The other aspect about loudness is it sounds like a simple idea, but it's actually a very complex idea. And it's made more complicated by the fact that loudness is a bit like news, in that there is true loudness and fake loudness. And I'll try to play some examples and give you some specific techniques and ideas about how to navigate that. So first, I'm going to very briefly bring us up to the present day. So engineers have always striven to get a signal onto the medium that is louder than the noise of the medium. So level was very key there, whether it be the Edison cylinder or 1930s radio with lots of static, or 45 RPM with lots of surface noise, 1950, cruising down in your great ride with the top down and a great dashboard radio, all the road noise. So we've always striven as engineers to have a signal that rises above that noise, but yet still sounds like music, and that's the trick. And of course, the infamous cassette. We were fighting against noise on the cassette. But this cassette was a huge change in itself. It was the beginning of music on the go, the Walkman, people carrying around their tunes in their playlists with them. The first huge change was the compact disc. 1982, believe it or not, before many of you were born. This was the very first time in the history of audio that the dynamic range of the medium was actually larger than the dynamic range of music. So before we had to compress and condense the music down from its natural lows and highs, or loud and soft, to fit into the medium. With the compact disc, that wasn't necessary. But there was a very steep learning curve with the compact disc. It wasn't just a matter of roll out the lathe and roll in the compact disc recorder. Engineers had to learn a whole new technology. For example, we no longer needed the EQ that we used to need on vinyl to compensate for things. So it took a while to learn that. The early CDs tended to be bright because engineers thought they were cutting a lacquer when they weren't. So there was a huge requirement to learn new techniques with the compact disc, and that lesson was learned. And things have gotten a lot better since then. Finally, to the point of iTunes, which is another huge change, where files began to replace discs. And lately, the hugest change is the total takeover of streaming. And when I say total takeover, Universal Music Group just announced that they are making $10 million a day on streaming. So streaming is really here to stay. It's our new world. And what streaming amounts to in terms of audio, and I'll explain this later, is that we're going to be transitioning from a world of peak normalized sound to loudness normalized sound, and what that means. Because that is a huge shift that requires us all to understand what loudness really is and how it really works. So up until this time, the primary tool for loudness was just cranking up the level. And the main means for cranking up the level were compressors, such as the famous Fairchild or the LA2. And then lately we have incredible plugins, such as the Isotope Neutron. So all of these plugins or devices, they have one job, basically, to reduce dynamic range and raise level. Okay? So let's take a look at where we are today. So Pro Audio began in 1924. That was when General Electric came out with the first commercial loudspeaker. In 1924, we were getting 60 dB of dynamic range. Right, we can see that. About 0.3% distortion. cut to 1996, humans invent the digital brick wall limiter, the beginnings of the infamous loudness wars. And now, today, we have distortion super high, 20% or more, and we're using a dynamic range of 12 dB on most of our pop records. So we've got 60 times more distortion and 1/5 the dynamic range because of our quest for loudness. So that's got to tell you that something is not sustainable here. Something is not being thought about correctly if this is where we're at. So a bunch of engineers decided we've got to do something about this. I mean, what's the point of having great recordings if everything is like smashed and compressed into 6 dB of 12 dB of dynamic range, and it's like blaring at you? What's the point of what are we doing here? So they began to study what was missing. They began to study dynamic range. And the first question was, what kind of dynamic range do people expect? What are they comfortable with? And we found that that depends on the venue where you are. So if you're in a movie theater, you'll take looks like about 60 dB of dynamic range. So the blue is the noise. You might have someone chewing popcorn or unwrapping cellophane, but the noise is low. Then the green is all that average level. And in the movies, we have about 24 dB of peak headroom, which allows the gunshot to sound like a gunshot and not like a finger snap. So home theater, they'll take less dynamic range because you're in a home theater, maybe the kids are playing Nintendo in the back and you're not playing it quite as loud. In a living room, people will take even less dynamic range because maybe someone's cooking in the kitchen or someone's talking, so there's more noise. So forth, kitchen and so forth, car even less. In-flight entertainment, well, because the noise of the jet is so loud, we're talking about we can only accept about 12 dB of dynamic range. Now here's a question for all of you. In terms of dynamic range, where on this chart is the average pop record today? Any guesses? Is it iPod? Is it bedroom? It's certainly not cinema. Is it car? The answer is the average pop record today falls to the right of in-flight entertainment. So this is where we're at, and this is the problem that we need to solve, because there's no need to do that any longer and still be loud. We can be loud without doing that. So we're coming out of the world of peak normalization. So as we went into digital, everything was put up to zero. Everything to zero. That was the conventional wisdom. Raise it up so everything peaks at zero. That's the best we can do. Well, the issue with that is that different kinds of music have different amounts of peak. So if we want to watch a movie, we need much more peak to allow for whispers and screams and gunshots and crickets and everything, explosions. But when it comes to super loud rock and roll, well, we can compress it and have less peak. But the end result is all of these programs have different loudnesses. So the rock and roll track is 24 dB louder than the movie. And this is an issue especially for streaming, because with streaming, at a touch of a button, we can hear any track from any era. So if we're playing, let's say, a Fats Waller track from 1930, and it's nice and quiet, it's uncompressed, then accidentally we switch to Anderson .Paak, for example, and we were listening to that Fats Waller loud, and this comes in at 24 dB hotter, you can really blow your eardrums. So it's not just a matter of listener experience, but safety. So streaming had to solve this problem. They had to make tracks play at constant level to avoid injuring people, and so people didn't have to constantly crank the knob. So this led to this new idea of loudness normalization, which you'll see here. And basically the trick is we lower everything down. So we lower everything down so that the different greens all become the same. So the way this is done is we choose a target, such as -24, which is where television is today, and we bring down the rock track by 24 dB. We could leave the movie the way it is, and the end result is whatever station we're watching, whether it's the movie or the news broadcast or the radio station or the talk station or the rock station, things are fairly consistent. All right? So just to show this another way, this is what peak normalization looks like. Imagine each of these tools as a different kind of music. So let's say this big buzzsaw blade is a symphony. It's got a lot of dynamic range. Let's say this little axe head here, or whatever it is a heavy metal track. Very little dynamic range. So in the old world, these are all peak normalized. Now, the end result is the loudnesses are different, because we can think of the loudness as the center of gravity. So the symphony becomes much lower, and the heavy metal track becomes much louder, and the loudnesses are all over the map. What we've been doing to solve this up to now is compressing the daylights out of everything. So if we compress the heck out of everything, we do solve the problem of things being roughly the same level, but look what happened to the symphony. It's become a pitiful shadow of its former self. So this isn't the answer either. So what is the answer? This loudness normalization world, where we bring everything down, and everything can then be its full, loud and proud self. So that's in a nutshell of why we had to do this. We now have tools to allow this and technology to allow this. The first thing that we now have that's new is a way to measure loudness. We never before had an agreed upon way of measuring the loudness of a track. We could measure its level, but that is very different from its loudness. So now we have loudness units. You've all probably heard of them. We have loudness units full scale and so forth. And we have actual regulations governing that. EBU 128 in Europe, and American Television Standard A85 in the US. So we are there. Loudness normalization is a fact of life. And we have new tools such as meters that read these loudness units. And we have new targets. What is happening now is that each of these streaming services are basically networks that ingest your music. Now, we like to say my track is going to drop on Friday. That sounds like cool. My record's going to drop on Friday. Well, what's really happening is your record is getting ingested. I know it doesn't sound as dramatic or as fun, but it's like the Borg. These streaming services are pulling all this stuff in, and when the track comes in, it's scanned for a loudness value, and that value stays with that track. It cannot be changed. It's a regulated measurement. And then the streaming service, based on its target, will raise or lower your track to meet that target. And there's not a damn thing we can do about it. That is it, folks. Rick Rubin cannot call Spotify and say, hey, dudes, I don't want -14 to be my track level. I want it to be -6. Sorry, it's just not going to work that way. So this is the world we have to deal with. Now, there are a variety of targets. So Spotify is at -14. YouTube -13, Apple Music -16, and so forth. So how do we deal with all this stuff and make sure that our records are playing the way we want them to play? Well, here's the issue. So we've always relied upon level. Level has been the hammer to get stuff loud. But in the new world of streaming, we no longer control the level. That level is taken out of our hands. The streaming service controls it. So how do we do optimal loudness now? Well, there's good news. And the main part of the good news is that level is really not loudness. It is not the same thing at all. And that's our way out of this, to understand what true loudness is and how to achieve it. So level is basically an objective measurement of a single variable, SPL, watts, volts, RMS. It's a really simple thing. It's the way a telephone picks it up, or a microphone. Our ears do not work that way. Our ears are perceptual. So for a human being, loudness is perceptual. It's subjective. It's the result of pitch, balance, tonality, transient response, and dynamic range. And these are the values we now have to look at instead of just raw level. Now, level and loudness are related, clearly, because the more level, the more loudness. But tracks with identical levels can have very different loudnesses, and that's where we come in, to make our tracks truly loud by focusing on the attributes that truly work. So let's go to some audio now, and I'll get back to the theory. So that was the history of where we're at. Before getting to the examples, or as part of the first example, I want to introduce you to something we in mastering call the Null Test. The Null Test, if you don't know, is a way of seeing what the difference is between two audio files and actually hearing the difference. So if I have a track such as this track here, a reggae track.
It's a propaganda war. Tell us lies like yes.
Okay, so that's our track. If I then copy that track, that file to another track, and I invert the polarity of one of them, basically you're doing a digital subtraction. We are subtracting one track from the other, and if I hit play, what should we hear? Nothing. So we're playing, we got nothing. And if we mute one, we get our audio back. And this is a very sensitive test. So for example, if I drop the clip gain of this track by even as much as a couple tenths of a dB, or a little bit more, so even dropping it by a tenth of a dB, we're already getting a difference. So we're able to hear the difference in these two files. Okay. So what I've set up here are 3 limiters. Why? Because the limiter is our main tool for getting this loudness. We all know that mastering puts on limiters. We're all looking for what's the best limiter for EDM or hip hop. So the limiter is our essential tool for getting this level up there. So I've got here 3 limiters that are pretty decent. We've got Xenon, FabFilter, and DMG. And here I've got the original track unlimited, so that's this.
It's a propaganda war.
Okay, so here's the Xenon.
It's a propaganda war. Tell us lies like years before.
Sounds pretty good. Sounds like the mix, yes. We can take a listen to FabFilter.
It's a propaganda war.
All right, sounds pretty good. Sounds like the mix. We can take a listen to DMG, another good one.
It's a propaganda.
So there's our 3 limiters. They're all doing a pretty good job, and I'm actually using less limiting than I would ordinarily do in a mastering. So this is actually not heavy limiting. First thing we notice is that they all sound different. Even though they're just doing gain reduction, they have a different sound.
It's a propaganda. It's a propaganda.
They all sound completely different. Well, what are they actually doing? How do we find out? We'll do our null test, all right? And this is something I call the limiter's little secret. So let's null the Xenon against the track. And we'll hear what the limiter is actually doing under the hood. So this is going on in the audio. We're not actually perceiving it because it's inside, but this is what's happening. Let's take a listen to what's happening with FabFilter. Nice. So this is temporal distortion, and this is what's happening with DMG. Now that's why these limiters all sound different. There's no EQ going on, but this distortion changes the tonality of the original signal. But the message here is this is what we're doing to all of our music. All of it has this stuff going on inside of it, and that's got to affect us as human beings. So that's the cost of using limiters to bring up level to the max. We're basically tainting music. Okay, so that's one of the problems. But there's a way out. So let's take a look at the attributes that make true level. Here we've got 3 mixes. This one obviously has virtually no compression, no limiting. This one has a bit more, and this one has a lot more. As you would expect, if I play them down, we're going to hear a very big difference in level.
Don't stop to diddle daddle. Stop this foolish rattle. Come on, swing me, boy. Swing it, brother, swing. Ready to go. And there ain't nobody gonna hold me down. Say, listen, boy. Hurry up and send me, let me go to town.
So that's a level of about -17 RMS. And if we then go to the next track, obviously it's going to be a bit hotter.
There's no way this is ever gonna work out now, baby. We both.
So now we're up around -9, which is actually lower than most pop tracks. And finally here, which is kind of typical of a really aggressive track these days. So obviously more level. But what happens if we make the level all the same? So on this next line here, I've matched the levels to minus 17 RMS on all 3 tracks. So the levels are now the same. Very similar to what happens on streaming. So here's the first track. Oops.
Don't stop to diddle daddle. Stop this foolish prattle. Come on, swing it, boy. Swing it, brother, swing. Ready to go. And there ain't nobody gonna hold me down. Sit and listen, boy. Hurry up and send me limb.
There's no way this is ever gonna work out now, baby. We both come from different worlds. There's no way.
Don't stop.
What the hell just happened? The world just got turned upside down. It's like Alice in Wonderland. Quiet became loud and loud became quiet. Notice that the track that's the most compressed is now the smallest sounding and the lowest level. That's because compressors, although we think of them as making stuff louder, they don't. They make stuff smaller. They raise the average level up, but we no longer have the benefit of that raised level because the streaming service has taken that away. So what you're hearing here is exactly how these tracks would sound on Spotify, or actually Apple Music. So if we want this fusion track to be really slamming loud, we just don't do this anymore. It's not going to work. So streaming has taken away the level control. But what has it given us in return? Headroom, right? So now we have all this unused space that we can bring back the snares and the kick drums and so forth. It has given us back better transient response. It's given us the freedom to create mixes as dynamic as we want to without fear of we're not loud enough. Hey, it sounds great, man, can you make it louder? It's freedom from clipping just so our music is loud enough. It allows us to deliver our mixes to the listener the same as they're heard in the studio. Now, I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly. Artists are very creative. Artists have actually embraced the world of compression and limiting and used it artistically. EDM depends on it. A lot of modern hip-hop depends on it. And urban music depends on extreme compression and limiting. And that's all good. But don't force it on the folk music or on the jazz. Now, I'm running out of time, so I won't go any further, but what I would suggest in terms of how you mix for this is get back into using a VU meter. The thing about a VU meter is that it's been around since 1940. It is logarithmic, so it sounds like what we hear. It's a very good visual guide for loudness. You can see 1/10 of a dB in it. It's kind of got a what you see is what you get value. It doesn't overread low frequencies, and I'll show you how we can use it successfully here. We now have VU meters in the box that are actually real VU meters. They actually work like a real VU. They have the proper ballistics, so they really do sound and look like what they should. We can set a calibrating value in the back. So we can set that reference, for example, to be -12, which would then match, for example, Spotify quite nicely at -12. And if we want to use a loud reference track as we're mixing, we're very simple. We just simply adjust that reference for a comfortable 0 VU. And basically, if you set that VU meter for, I would say, a couple of dB above the target, you'll end up with a really great sounding mix that really works well. And that's about the end of my rushed presentation. I hope it gives you some food for thought.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alan. Hey, it's Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. I hope you enjoyed that presentation from Alan Silverman from MixCon 2019. I thought it was a great one. If you want to go even deeper on the subject of mastering, I've got a free mastering workshop for you. It's called Mastering 101, and you can get it at sonicscoop.com/mastering101. That's sonicscoop.com/mastering101. If you want a full premium course that's all about mastering, and you really want to get a system for mastering tracks for your own clients, you can check out my full-length premium course, Mastering Demystified. Can't recommend that highly enough. Tremendous testimonials on that one I can share with you. We've gotten great feedback on it, and people are doing really great work because of it, so you can check it out at masteringdemystified.com. But if you want something totally free on mastering, check out my free workshop, sonicscoop.com/mastering101. That's sonicscoop.com/mastering101 to go even deeper. This has been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.